So the final thing we want to focus on is organizational design. So basically, not only categorizing how organizations are designed within their structure, but also thinking about, is the organizational design of the organization a good fit for their environment? So this is the process of coordinating the structural elements of an organization in the most appropriate manner. It's basically matching the personal profile, if you will, of the entire organization to the actual role that it has within the broader environment. Approaches include classical and neoclassical approaches, the contingency approach, the Mitzberg framework, and interorganizational design. We're going to talk about each one of these in turn, and there's a little bit of a history to these as well. Classical is the oldest of the theories. Neoclassical was a reaction to the classical theory. Contingency was a reaction to both of those theories. And the Mitzberg framework is more of a detailed, kind of more modern way to look at multiple factors that go into how organizations are designed. So let's dive right in as we finish up on organizational design. So the very first organizational design, again, is that classical organizational theory, the approach that assumes that there is a single best way to design organizations. And this is very theory X. This is about hierarchical organizations. And part of this theory, though, assumed that the hierarchical organization, the theory X way of looking at the world, was the one true way to create an organization. So there isn't a lot of contingency here. This is the one way we should set up organizations. This approach assumes that managers need to have close control over their subordinates and calls for designing organizations with tall hierarchies and a narrow span of control. They're very bureaucratic. They tend to be insensitive to human needs, theory X, and they're not very suited to changing environments. Now, I will say that modern classical organizational theories, so basically very high, tall hierarchies with narrow spans of control, can occur with a strong focus also on human needs. But there is no question, the taller the organization, the more bureaucratic it becomes, the more decision making is spread through a series of manager levels. And it is also typically an organization that is going to be slow to change how it functions or what it produces or how it reacts to the environment. So a lot of larger organizations may indeed actually have a classical structure, but they're usually also they're basically in fields where what they're producing is fairly stable and they've been around for a long time. Now, it should also be noted that these are also the organizations that sometimes surprise everyone as they go out of business. If you ask someone in the 50s, 60s, and 70s about Sears or J.C. Penney's, the two department stores that dominated at the time, they probably would have had a hard time imagining that either of those stores would struggle moving into the future. Though both are around, they have definitely gone through massive and unpleasant changes as they've had to break out of this classical mode to stay relevant in the modern work, or basically modern economy. So in contrast to classical organizational theory is neoclassical organizational theory. It's an attempt to improve on the classical organizational theory and argues that not only economic effectiveness, but also employee satisfaction should be the goal of industrial organizations. This approach assumes that managers do not have to carefully monitor their subordinates and calls for designing an organization with flatter hierarchies and wider span of control. It's more theory Y, and it's about empowering and motivating employees. Now, it should be noted that neoclassical organizational theory is basically falling into the same trap as classical organizational theory of this is the one way to do things. We should have all organizations focused on giving employees empowerment, following theory Y, focusing on the value of our employees, and assuming that those employees will therefore be automatically motivated. We can get rid of a lot of this management structure, and we should have a less hostile or a less oversight in those managers. Now, again, these organizations tend to be more fluid and more capable of changing, but they also are not a perfect fit for all types of business. In other words, we still haven't quite got to where we need to be because both of these theories assume that there is a one right way. Comparing the two of these in a very simple way is the following slide. We have the classical versus neoclassical theory. So again, just broadly speaking, the more that you see hierarchies, the more you see multiple levels of management, and the smaller the span of the control, the more likely you're looking at a classical organizational design. This is going to be an organizational design that does fit itself well towards mass essential production. So the more an organization actually creates a product, the more likely you're going to see this type of an outline. And the more likely that the people that actually produce the products are basically doing assembly line, very simple skills, the more likely it is going to be necessary for some direct oversight to make sure those production quotas that are expected for the organization to be successful to be maintained. A neoclassical organizational design is going to be a lot flatter. There are still going to be maybe levels of management, but there'll be less of them, and each manager will have a much larger number of people reporting to them because the assumption is that the manager is not having to necessarily focus on their production. They're having to focus on the bigger picture of how to actually sell, market, and position the organization. This is going to lend itself well to situations that are very volatile, maybe changing very quickly. It's a flat hierarchy with a wide span of control, but very loose control over the subordinates. So it's going to work well when the subordinates, the people that are actually producing the products, are highly self-motivated. This is often the kind of organizational design we'll find in more highly skilled work, more white-collar work, or more work where people are actually kind of capable of doing a lot of different things. When we think about the size of a university, we often find that though there are still some levels of reporting, there's still managers, there's department heads, there's deans, and then there's the actual leadership. It's a relatively small span of control. And what I mean by that is that the provost's office is often overseeing 6 to 10 schools. Each one of those schools may have 5 to 10 departments. And within the department might have upwards to 20 to 30 faculty members, which means one department chair is overseeing 20 to 30 individuals. This works well, though, because those individuals are very highly trained, know what roles are expected of them, and have varied different tasks that they're completing in their day-to-day functions. And what they're actually producing is education and educational content and scientific research and scientific rigor that is consumed by the rest of the world. This is going to be different than, for example, an assembly line that is producing car parts. So there is no one right or wrong way, and both classical and neoclassical have kind of an implied, this is the one way to create an organization. So that brings us to our next overall design, the contingency approach. It's more a contemporary approach that recognizes that no one approach to organizational design is best, but the best design is the one that best fits with the existing environmental conditions. So it basically says we're not looking for one way that always works. We're looking for the way that works for this contextual situation. So there's basically two broad types of organizations under the contingency approach. There's the mechanicistic organization. It's an internal organizational structure in which people perform specialized jobs, have rigid rules imposed, and authority is vested in the top few ranked officials. And we'd think of this as classical organizational theory, or Theory X. McDonald's might be a good example of this. Or an organic organization, an internal organizational structure in which jobs tend to be very general, there are less rules, and decisions can be made by lower level employees. So basically computer companies, organizations that are kind of in a very highly flexible environment would be more organic organizations. So really, contingency approach really isn't adding much to what we've already discussed. It's simply kind of renaming Theory X versus Theory Y, or classical versus neoclassical, but recognizing that it's more about fitting one of these roles or one of these organizational structures to the reality of what the organization does. So broadly, just taking a look at the I hate that word, mechanistic versus organic designs. When we look at the structure, we're looking at stability, specialization, formal rules, and authority. And for the mechanical organization, we see that change is unlikely. In other words, it's going to be a stable environment. There is requirement for specialization for the organization to succeed. Because of that specialization, there's going to be a fair amount of rules, and authority is going to be centralized to a top few people. Now, one of the ways we can kind of look at this from the other direction is if we're trying to design an organizational structure, we might want to ask, how stable is the environment? The more stable the environment is, the more likely a mechanical kind of organization may make more sense. But it may not even be stability. It may be, what are the level of rules required? So some organizations and in some fields, there's an enormous amount of federal regulations, state regulations, or even a professional organization's requirements for how the organization functions. So the more that we have a rigid set of rules that have to be followed for an organization to succeed, also the more likely a mechanical organization is going to be appropriate. When we look at organizational structures, we see environments that are more change likely, that there's generally more generalists, not specialists, that are required to do the work. There are less formal rules and more flexibility in how people get the work done, and the authority, therefore, is more decentralized, diffused throughout the organization. So again, we might think about this. If I have a very highly changing environment that my organization is trying to create a product in, I think of social media or basically mobile platforms would be an example of an environment that is changing greatly from year to year, decade to decade. That might suggest to me that I want to set up an organic design. If the people that are working in the organization are mainly generalists, in other words, I need people that are good at a lot of different things to get this work done, that again is going to lend itself more to an organic setting. And again, if there's not a lot of rigid rules that are required to do the work, that considered flexibility and decentralization is more likely. So let's look at some more modern examples of how we can think about organizational design. So the third framework we're going to look at is Mintzberg's framework, and it's a little bit more complex, but honestly, we're looking at a fairly complex issue. So again, the idea of this model, like all models, is to try to take a very complex idea and give us some building blocks that we can conceptualize to help us decide what kind of organization there is. In other words, what Mintzberg was saying is that contingency theory is great, but how do you actually determine what kind of organization you have? And how do you determine if that organization is a good fit for the environment? So this theory is an attempt to get at that. So basically, Henry Mintzberg claimed that organizations are composed of 5 basic elements, or groups of individuals, and any of which may predominate in an organization. The element that predominates will determine the most effective design. So basically, what he's came up with is a model which helps us do diagnostics on first identifying the 5 groups and then asking which group is most important to this organization's function. So Mintzberg's 5 basic elements is the operating core, the strategic apex, the middle line, the technostructure, and the support staff. So the operating core is the employees who perform the basic work related to the organization's product or services. So at a university, those would be the professors. At an automobile manufacturing company, those would be the people actually on the assembly line. If you were in an advertising agency, it would be the actual agents that come up with the new advertisements. So the operating core is the group that actually produces the products or services that are consumed outside the organization. The strategic apex is the top-level executives responsible for running the organization. So the people that are actually making the decisions, the owners, the executives, the CEOs. The middle line is the managers who transfer information between those higher and lower levels within the organizational hierarchy. So the people that are responsible for communicating the decisions of the strategic apex to the operating core, and also making sure that the operating core is performing in a way that meets the expectations of the strategic apex. The technostructure is the organizational specialist responsible for standardizing various aspects of the organization's activities. Accounting, auditing, HR might be in this area as well, legal counsel. All of these are basically the support structures that help the other 3, the operating core, the strategic apex, and the middle line managers actually function. And finally, the support staff, individuals who provide indirect support to the organization. So the difference between technostructure and support staff are basically advisors. The technostructure are the people that actually make sure that everything is moving smoothly. Now, once you've identified these, and I think it's pretty easy to see that all organizations probably have some form of this in all 5 levels. There are people making decisions. There are people doing the actual work. There's managers that are kind of communicating and making sure that things are flowing. There's the people that are involved in creating the technostructure. In other words, they're supporting the organizational activities and aspects, and maybe even the technology of the organization to allow it to function. And then there's actually advisors and consultants that actually work with the organization. So based on these 5 elements, we start looking at 5 different types of organizations based on which one is dominating and is most important. So again, we have 5 organizational designs. The simple structure is an organization characterized by being small and informal with a single powerful individual, often founding entrepreneur who's in charge of everything. In other words, if we have an organization where there is a clear leader, a charismatic person that's in charge, is the face of the company, is the person that is making the final decisions, that would be a situation where you need to make sure that the organization is structured to where that person has the influence throughout the organization. And therefore, the most important part is that strategic apex. A machine bureaucracy is an organizational form in which the work is highly specialized, decision making is centralized at the top, and the work environment is not prone to change. This would be dominated by the technostructure. So what's most important is how things are being done. And this would be an example of a bureaucracy or a Theory X organization, a classical organizational theory. The next one we have is the professional bureaucracy, organizations, hospitals, and universities in which there are a lot of rules to follow, but employees are highly skilled and free to make decisions of their own. This is the operating core. So the people that actually are doing the work are the most important part of the organization. However, there's still a lot of structure around them. And you can start to see when we talk about Mintzberg's framework, we're coming up with some other options than just hierarchical versus flat organizations. We're starting to look at it in a more complex way. Finally, we have divisional structure, the form used by many large organizations in which separate autonomous units are created to deal with entire product lines, freeing top management to focus on large-scale strategic decisions. So this would generally be a midline control. In other words, the managers in the middle are the ones that are most important because yes, there's decisions being made at top and yes, things are being produced, but we're also having to oversee specific product lines. And finally, we have the adhocracy, a highly informal organization in which specialists work in teams, coordinate with each other on various products. So this would be an example where that support staff, the legal, the consultants are the most important people in the organization. And this would be organizations that are mainly focused on idea development or generating new ideas in a way that's actually marketable. So summarizing Mintzberg's ideas, we have those 5 designs: simple, machine, professional, divisional, and adhocracy. We have our description, we have our dominant group, and we have examples. So a dominant group that's dominated by the apex, the strategic apex, is generally going to be a small entrepreneurial business. Not always, but generally. The technostructure is usually going to be a very stable organization that is in a stable environment and needs a lot of hierarchy. Government offices and bureaucracies are an example of this. The professional bureaucracy is where the operating core is most important. A university is a good example here. The divisional structure is where the middle line management, and this is usually what we're going to find at much larger organizations who have decided to move away from that Theory X hierarchical situation. This will be multi-divisional businesses such as General Motors. And finally, we have that support staff that's most important, software development and small kind of idea-focused groups. So that gives us a general idea, but let's continue to look a few more slides into when we're talking about organizational structure, things we need to consider. And that's inter-organizational designs. And this is recognizing that not only do we need to think about organizational designs as single organizations, sometimes multiple organizations work with each other. So these are organizational designs in which 2 or more organizations come together for a common good. And there's basically 2 types: conglomerates and strategic alliances. Conglomerates are a form of organizational diversification in which an organization, usually a very large multinational one, adds an entirely unrelated business or product to its organizational design. So we're talking about basically mega corporations. Samsung Electronics, a lot of automobile, textile, and chemical, and also food companies would fall into these categories. In other words, the organization has become so large that it often absorbs entire businesses with their own organizational design into their broader portfolio. Then the other one is a strategic alliance, a type of inter-organizational design in which 2 or more separate companies combine forces to develop and operate a specific business. So we see strategic alliances a lot of times when there's multiple smaller organizations who form together to compete against larger organizations. A good example of this actually is a lot of military contracts. There's a few very large companies that always put in bids for military contracts. However, sometimes what you'll find is that the bid for a particular contract is not one company that could do the job, but a group or a strategic alliance of 2 or 3 companies that combined could also produce the product that's being requested. We also see strategic alliances a lot in media. So there are, again, large companies like Marvel, for instance, under Disney, that actually produce media and content. However, a lot of movies, if you've ever watched a movie where at the start there's 4 different screens of 4 different companies that are involved, that's an example of a strategic alliance. Various small companies gathered together to create a bigger movie or product for consumption to hopefully compete with those larger companies. So when we look at strategic alliances, there's again some subcategories. Mutual service consortia, a type of strategic alliance in which two similar companies with the same or similar industries pool their resources to receive a benefit that would be too difficult or expensive to attain alone. Low risk ways of entering a new market. So for instance, you might have 2 companies that do fruit juices, and currently both of them have some of the market, but not as much as the large mega companies that have the entire market. So they might actually come together in a consortium to basically allow both of their products to be taking advantage of the relationships that each company has made. We have value chain partnerships, a strategic alliance between companies in different industries that have complementary capacity. So this is a bit of a more of a high commitment, but this might be a permanent relationship between, for example, a mining company that creates raw materials, a transportation company that transports those materials, and a company that actually turns those materials into usable products. Finally, we have joint ventures, and this is what I was kind of referring to a little bit more when I was talking about media examples. It's a strategic alliance in which several companies work together to fulfill an opportunity that require their capacities of one another. Marketing, knowledge, technology. Companies come together to share capacity, but are not closely tied to one another, nor able to do it without each other, and are likely to also come back apart once the project is actually finished. So these are just another way or set of ways to kind of think about how organizations are actually structured. And though we're ending on organizational structure, I would actually loop this back to the very start of the class, that considering organizational structure allows us to have a better big picture of interventions that we may be doing at more of an individual or team level within the organization. So hopefully this class has helped you kind of look at organizations through a different lens, to think about how we diagnose organizational issues, how we actually categorize organizations to begin with, how we look at them, how we think about them in models, and then how we identify problems that we could actually apply organizational psychological principles to. So as always, I've always closed these. Finally, if you have any additional questions or even questions about the class in general, feel free to go on to Canvas. I will continue looking at those, and I thank you very much for attending this class, and hopefully it has been useful to you. Goodbye.